Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to represent the SMPTE Pittsburgh and welcoming Mr. Mark Schubin.
Thank you, Ed. Ed neglected to mention one of the most important things, which is after my talk, there will be dessert. So this is SMPTE's 100th anniversary, and it also happens to be the 200th anniversary of the incorporation of Pittsburgh as a city. Pittsburgh was incorporated as a township in 1771. And you're going to see me spell Pittsburgh both with and without an H. And that's because there was a period from 1890 to 1911 when Pittsburgh was officially spelled without an H. And since some of the stuff that I'll be showing is from that period, I will do it. As you can see, this book says where the movies played in downtown Pittsburgh, and it's got the H in parentheses. So our founder and first president, Charles Francis Jenkins, he was also the first honorary or honor roll member of the society. Difference between honorary and honor roll is whether you're dead or not. If you're dead, you're on the honor roll. If you're alive, you're honorary. It's the highest honor that SMPTE can give, and only 88 people got it in the first 100 years of the society. James Cameron is the 89th. He was a government worker in Washington. He was the secretary to what was called the life-saving service of the Treasury Department, which became the Coast Guard. It was merged with the revenue cutters of the Treasury Department. He was a pioneer of movies. It's possible he was the first person to project movies to an audience. And he was also a pioneer of television, and unquestionably, he was the first person to transmit wireless moving images. And just for those of you who are not familiar with it, he founded the Society of Motion Picture Engineers. The T was added to SMPTE for television in 1950. So everybody knows he's the first president. Who was the second president? And what I'm showing you is what SMPTE's website had up until a few weeks ago when I pointed out to headquarters that the second president wasn't listed there. It went from 1918 to 1922, like there was a 4-year period with no president. Well, the second president turned out to be Herbert Camp of Westinghouse in Pittsburgh. And he was also on the first SMPTE Board of Governors, and a little bit more about his role coming up. One of the things he did as privilege of being president was arrange for the Society's fall convention to take place in Pittsburgh at the William Penn Hotel, which had opened the same year that SMPTE opened. And there's the transactions of the SMPTE, what became the Journal. And you can see it's from Pittsburgh. That was also the first issue to have an index of papers published to that point. And here's the president's address, and he talks about the industry and how 1 billion feet of motion picture film had been shot. This is not distributed. This is actually shot. This is the individual programs. So SMPTE has 3 legs of a tripod. There's Thomas Edison, the second SMPTE honorary member with a tripod. And they are education, which is what's happening here tonight, membership, which is also happening here tonight, and standards. And for those of you who don't participate in the SMPTE standards work, I'll give you some idea of what that's about. This is the first SMPTE standards principle, or any standard principle, equal pain. And the idea is that you're not going to get a standard if somebody comes out winning. So here were 2 1-inch videotape recorders, one created by Sony, one created by Ampex. Very, very similar, but not quite the same. You could not take a tape off of one and play it on the other. And 2 of the networks said, we're just not going to buy it unless you guys come up with a common standard. And so the society had honorary member Fred Remley from the University of Michigan convene a standards group to work on what became the Type C standard. And Sony was allowed to keep certain features they considered very important, and Ampex was allowed to keep certain features they considered very important. And both of them had to do retooling, so there was equal pain. And lo and behold, the Type C standard came out. And that was the first to offer what we now refer to as stunt mode playback. playback in forward and reverse and not necessarily at normal play speed. Here's another seemingly equal pain standard, was for HDTV production. And on the left, the gentleman in the hat is the director, Francis Ford Coppola, and that was at the SMPTE Winter Engineering Conference in San Francisco in 1981. And NHK, the Japan Broadcasting Corporation, had come up with a version of HDTV, but they had a 5:3 aspect ratio, and they had 1045 active lines. Active lines are lines that carry picture information. And so to prevent them from being the winner, the SMPTE standard had to change things, so they came up with a 16:9 aspect ratio and 1035 active lines. And is that SMPTE's most successful standard? Because you see 16:9 pictures all over the place, behind me, in my hotel room, at home, and so on. But this gets to standard principle number 2. You get the standards you deserve, which means if you don't participate in standardization work and you don't like what comes out, well, that's not necessarily the fault of the people who worked in the room. So what happened here was engineers worked on the standard, and they thought, wow, a great idea would be to have the minimum loss of area between production and display. And so they superimposed various rectangles of different display formats, and the result was 1.77 to 1, which is very close to 16:9, which is 1.78 to 1. And they said, okay, this is going to be the aspect ratio. This is just to point out that this problem of getting the standards you deserve dates way back to 1919 and probably even earlier. This is that same address by Herbert Camp of Westinghouse, the president of SMPTE, and he says, I wish to impress on you that our committees are not sufficiently active, and so I'm locking you in the room and I want to have you guys work on stuff. Well, here was the problem with the 16:9 aspect ratio, at least that derivation of the 16:9 aspect ratio. Minimum area loss sounds really great to an engineer, but cinematographers shoot for common sides. And the reason they shoot for common sides is a dramatic moment or a comedic moment might be when somebody enters or leaves the frame. Well, if you have that thing on the left, then people are entering and leaving the frame at different times in different aspect ratios. But if you have common sides, they're entering and leaving the frame at the same time. So that SMPTE standard, 240M, the first HDTV standard of the society, was actually opposed by SMPTE members as an American national standard, and 1035 lines is long gone. By the way, HDTV was not exactly a new idea. Here you can see a booklet published in Britain, and it says high definition television. The booklet was published in 1935, and they defined high definition television. It should be not less than 240 lines. And even before that, here was a demonstration of HDTV versus SDTV at the Berlin Radio Show in 1928. And look at how much better that one on the right looks. So you really need to go for HDTV, right? Except the one on the left is 30 lines, and that's what 30-line pictures shot off screen actually looked like. Now, I know some of you in the audience are saying, oh, yes, but you made that picture smaller than on the one on the left. Well, no matter how you look at it, I've shrunk it, I've changed the orientation. The off-screen 30-line picture looked a lot better than what they were showing at the radio show. So what was the real, most influential SMPTE standard? This is what the SMPTE standard community, when polled, came up with. SMPTE Standard 12, which was for time code. It's the basis for our whole post-production industry and much more. And there are time code summits that are going on this year. And, you know, why should they be doing summits now? Well, as you heard, Doug Trumbull is coming up with higher frame rate stuff, even 24 frames per second. If you divide it by the 1,000 over 1,001, you have issues. So there's lots of work to be done on time code. So this was an announcement of the very first SMPTE meeting. This was before it was even incorporated. This appeared in the Washington Evening Star on July 25th, 1916, but the meeting was the previous day. And this was the birth of SMPTE, and as you see, Henry Hubbard, the head of the National Bureau of Standards, did speak to the society. There were other speakers, one from the Patent Office who spoke about standardization, and one from George Washington University, and he also spoke about standardization. So what you saw in that SMPTE trailer with Donald Godfrey talking about how the government was going to step in and do standards if SMPTE didn't, seems like a great idea. I mean, after all, World War I was approaching, and the government needed standards for motion picture stuff. It's a great story. Too bad it isn't true. And how do we know that it isn't true? From a paper that was published in the SMPTE Transactions, Motion Picture Activities in the United States Army. This is the head of the Motion Picture Division of the Signal Corps. And the first thing he says is that, you know, the Army's been dealing with motion pictures for a long time, but just for entertainment. We show movies, even in tents, we show movies. Well, the Army's a big organization, it's got a lot of bases, and if they're going to show those movies around, they need some kind of standard. Well, that wasn't a problem because of the Edison Patent Trust, which I will talk about more later. Then another thing he says is there's no record of the Army realizing the instructional value of film prior to the entry of the United States into the World War. And then he explains it. He says, we had a small army up to that point, and so the usual training and drill was fine, and it wasn't until the Army increased in size very rapidly that they needed to do instruction. So when did the United States enter the World War? Well, the World War began in 1914. Here's the Pittsburgh Press talking about when the United States entered the war, and in case you can't read the date, I've made it bigger just over the eagle. April 6, 1917, the year after SMPTE was formed. And Lieutenant Colonel Prosser goes on, he says, I believe that the Army was the first agency of importance in the country to employ instructional pictures, and the first contract was let on April 5th, 1917, one day before that newspaper headline that you saw. And then he went on to say that training came first, and then other uses like figuring out ballistics and other things that you could do with motion pictures. So, no, World War I had nothing whatsoever to do with the forming of SMPTE, and the government had nothing whatsoever to do with the forming of SMPTE. But yet, SMPTE was formed, it was incorporated in 1916 in Washington, D.C. Well, why? And why in Washington? Well, in Washington because that's where Jenkins worked. He had a full-time job besides his work on movies. But also, he was in the business of selling movie systems. This is Jenkins's Fantascope. And he's concerned if he sells in one standard and somebody else comes up with some other standard, that's going to be a problem. And it would be much better if everyone worked together and, you know, they'd all be able to sell movie projectors and movie films to everybody who had projectors. Well, how many formats were there? This is the current Wikipedia page on film formats, and I've cut off the page at the bottom at 1916. But that's not all of them. There was a book that was published at the end of the 19th century called Living Pictures. It listed 89 different active incompatible formats and another 56 being proposed. And one of those, now some of these were accidental. You throw together some motion picture apparatus and maybe it's 65 millimeters wide, maybe it's 12 millimeters wide, maybe it's got sprockets at the bottom of the frame, maybe it's got sprockets at the top of the frame. But some were intentional. So in 1961, I believe it was, a book came out called The Edison Motion Picture Myth. And the main theme of the book was that actually it wasn't Edison who invented his motion picture system, but one of his employees, William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, who was also a SMPTE honorary member. And Dixon left Edison in 1895. And so he knew what Edison's patents had. He was intimately familiar with it. So if he was going to come up with something different, he had to make sure it was really different. And so he came up with this system called the Biograph. And the Biograph used film that was 68 millimeters wide. And there's one of the pictures, and you see the sprocket holes are right in the middle of the picture, and furthermore, they were punched in the camera. The film didn't come with sprockets cut in it to begin with. What's the connection between Pittsburgh and the biograph? Well, the first movie shot in Pittsburgh, which was about the Knights Templar parade in 1898, was shot on the biograph, but it wasn't the only one. There were movies shot at the Heinz factory of people packing pickles and packing other vegetables. There were movies shot at Westinghouse of the workers under surveillance, and they were all shot with the biograph. Also, biograph was based in New York. The company was there, their theater was there, and so on. But the very first public showing of biograph movies was in Pittsburgh in September of 1896, not in New York. So here is Jenkins talking about the formation of the society, and he'd been trying to do standards for a long time. SMPTE wasn't his first organization. He was a member of the Motion Picture Board of Trade. They had a standards group, so he went on that standard group. They met once, and then bluey, no more standards. So then they got replaced by the National Association of the Motion Picture Industry. They had a standards group. He went on that standards group. He goes to the standard meeting. He's the only one there. He tells the secretary, call people. They call, nobody comes. Bluey again. So he forms SMPTE, and the first official SMPTE meeting after the one in Washington, after the incorporation, is going to be in New York in October. And he goes there, and the usual gang of suspects shows up, and he figures it's going to be the same thing all over again. And he says it was indeed a critical time for the society, but lo and behold, two people show up from Pittsburgh. And they say, hey, can we help? And he says, great! And one of those was Herbert Camp, and the other one was Harvey Whibble, who was the chair of the Committee on Motion Picture Electrical Devices. And here's an ad from Westinghouse that appeared in the SMPTE Journal, and it looks almost as though, you know, Westinghouse could have done this at the embroidery convention, or they could have done it at, hosiery convention or whatever. They were simply supplying electrical equipment for theaters and for shooting, lighting. But it turns out that Westinghouse actually had some other irons in the fire, which I'll tell you about later. So what was SMPTE's first standard? You would think that SMPTE's first standard is standard number 1, but it isn't. Standard number 1 was for quadruplex videotape recorders, which came out in 1956. So there had been standards previously, and this is the first SMPTE standards. They didn't have any numbers. They appeared in the journal in July of 1917, and just in order of where they appeared on the page, this was the first SMPTE standard, film speed, and it said, the film movement of 60 feet per minute through motion picture mechanisms shall be considered as a standard speed. 60 feet per minute is 16 frames per second for 4 perforation, 35 millimeter film. This is standards principle number 3, which is stamping a de facto standard is still useful. So all of that stuff I showed you in the previous slide, that was basically the standards of the Edison Patent Trust. And by stamping it, SMPTE was saying, okay, this is not Edison standards anymore. This is industry standards. You can build to them. If we think it's going to be something different, we're going to change it as an industry. And 16 frames per second seems pretty low, but here's some images from the case files of C. Francis Jenkins, although the images that are being shown are actually Edison. Now there's 1 frame per second, very clearly not motion pictures. But now we're going to switch to 5 frames per second, and that, that's motion pictures to me. There are issues with flickering, but not so much with the motion. And by the time we get to 15, no question that that's working. And that's unfiltered. That's without trying to do any kind of temporal shaping. But then along comes this guy, and he writes something in the Transactions of the Society of Motion Picture Engineers, and he says, I have some concerns about film speed. And I noticed that your standards committee is thinking about having a projection speed of 80 feet per minute and a taking speed of 60 feet per minute. Well, when you watch old movies, you see everyone walking around very fast, and you go, oh, well, that's because we're projecting them now at 24 frames per second, but originally they would have been projected at slower. No, they were projected at a higher speed even back then. And the reason for that, two reasons. One was flicker. So what I just showed you before had constant pictures that were showing, so you didn't have a flicker issue. But the other was money. If you do faster projection, then you can do more shows in a day, and you can collect more money. But who is this guy, Richard Rowland? Well, he says, we in the First National organization. At that time, he was the president of First National, which got absorbed into Warner Brothers. But here's his obituary, which appeared in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in 1947 when he died. He was born in 1880. And he started at age 12 at the Grand Opera House as an assistant spotlight operator. Now, the spotlights in those days used what was called calcium light. Calcium was calcium oxide. What I'm showing you here is calcium hydroxide, pretty similar. It has a characteristic called candoluminescence, so it gives off more light than what you would expect a black body heated to that temperature to give off. So he starts at age 12 at the Pittsburgh Opera House, and when the first movies get shown in Pittsburgh, he says, we should do this in the Opera House. Well, he was the son of the owner of Pittsburgh Calcium Light. By the way, these are the first movies that were shown in Pittsburgh. Both Edison's Vitascope and Lumiere's cinematograph were shown on the very same day with ads on the very same page. And I'll show you some of what they were showing. But by the end of 1896, the very same year, they also showed the Biograph. That was from SMPTE honorary member William Dixon. The kinematograph, the magnoscope, the phantoscope, that's Jenkins's system, and something called the cinematograph, which was created by a local boy, and I'll explain why he did that. And there were even more in later years. So this was what was shown at the Bijou. It's called The Picture of a Kiss. And it's a very descriptive title for the movie. We'll watch the whole movie. It doesn't take that long. That's May Irwin on the right and John Rice on the left. And there it is, The Kiss. And there's a list of other stuff. They showed a baby parade. They showed the angry waters of some pier, a watermelon eating contest, somebody winking. So it was all actualities, little things, nothing that really had a plot. So that was at the Bijou, and over at the Avenue, we have the cinematograph. This is from France, and therefore it's classier. So down at the bottom, we have that Mr. Beaumont Smith has been especially engaged at a large salary during the exhibition of the cinematograph to talk about it. But notice something that it says under cinematograph, and I've blown it up here a little. It says, this title rigidly protected by trademark and copyright. So when somebody decided to copy it, he just called it the cinematograph. Well, after a while, people got tired of just watching kisses and things like that, so we have the first motion pictures with plots, and this is the last image from the Great Train Robbery, and that's someone actually firing a pistol into the camera, and that was made by Edwin Stanton Porter, who was from Connellsville and who did some work in Pittsburgh. He's on the SMPTE Honor Roll, and why is he on the SMPTE Honor Roll? Not for his directing, although he directed some really major motion pictures, but also because he invented possibly the most popular projector in the world, the Simplex. And his brother, by the way, later marketed his motion pictures from Pittsburgh, and it was Famous Players that he was marketing. Famous Players became Paramount, so the Paramount marketing department began in Pittsburgh. What's even better about Pittsburgh is this, the world's first dedicated movie theater in 1905, at least the first long-term dedicated movie theater. There had been previous storefronts in Los Angeles and in New Orleans that showed nothing but movies, but this one lasted. And you just heard there's a new SMPTE section in Poland. Well, the second one was in Poland. because there was a guy from Poland in Pittsburgh. He saw it. He said, I got to bring this back. And basically everybody who wasn't in Pittsburgh who saw this said, I got to bring this back. So it spread to Chicago. It spread across the country. By the next year, there were literally thousands of these systems around. Again, it's the guy who invented the cinematograph, and they had up to 40 shows per day. But one interesting thing about a dedicated movie theater, and that is the lights go out. And if the lights go out, then hanky-panky takes place in the seats. And that was not so good, and so here we see an ordinance that picture theaters must light up, and that's where we have those exit signs and so on that wreak havoc on high dynamic range images. Pittsburgh's glass industry plays a role. Again, back to Rowland. Rowland's professional career when he left the Opera House was as a bookkeeper for American Window Glass, which is Pittsburgh's oldest glass manufacturer. The Bureau of Standards had a glass operation in Pittsburgh, and they made optical glass. Think, well, window glass is just fine. You put stuff into cameras and stuff, it has to be really special glass. And Pittsburgh Plate Glass came up with optical glass in 1915, and then that group of Pittsburgh Plate Glass got taken over by the U.S. Geophysical Laboratory for the war effort. Pittsburgh's glass was so famous that here you see a film chain, and in the center of the film chain there's a piece of just what they're calling Pittsburgh. They don't even have to say anything else about it. This is Pittsburgh 2043, 4 millimeters wide. So back to Rowland, he starts getting involved in film. He took over Pittsburgh Calcium Light from his father, which was supplying the spotlights to the local theaters, but because he was supplying spotlights, he also supplied other things, tickets, and so on. And Rowland said, why don't we also deliver films? And so this is one of his advertisements for films. He says, films for rent, and it's Pittsburgh Calcium Light, and it's got a Pittsburgh address. But notice that this ad appeared in the New York Clipper. That's how important the Pittsburgh film exchanges were, that people even as far away as New York wanted to deal with them. He sold out in 1910 after only 10 years of owning Pittsburgh Calcium Light to General Film, which was the film distribution arm of the Edison Patents Trust, and he got what he said was more money than I thought existed. Now, before he sold out, there was a conference at the Fort Pitt Hotel, which isn't here anymore, 1907 Motion Picture Conference, better known just as the Pittsburgh Conference. And on the left were the manufacturers of film equipment who showed up. Kodak was also there. And it led to the creation of the Motion Picture Patents Company, which was the trust that carried on Edison's patent trust. But it also led to the downfall because they were just blatant. So if you read the trial transcripts of the U.S. government versus the Motion Picture Patents Company, they say, and at the Pittsburgh conference, did you say you were going to try to drive the independent film companies out of business? Yes, sir. And then there was also a real bluey in Pittsburgh. In 1909, there was a film exchange, the Columbian Film Exchange in the Ferguson building, and it exploded. There was nitrate film at the time. Now, you might think, oh, they didn't store it properly or anything. No, they had a really good vault that they kept it in, but there was a ventilation issue, and the fumes escaped from the vault, and it was actually outside the vault that the explosion took place. But 75 people were injured. You see this over and over in SMPTE papers, led to better film storage practices, push for safety film, hazardous material regulations, new building codes, study of explosions, including high-speed film. And so here's the Department of Interior, Bureau of Mines, and their station near Pittsburgh is studying explosions using film wound on a revolving drum. Here's another mine thing from the SMPTE Journal in 1950, color cinematography in the mines, made by Modart Pictures in Pittsburgh. And it wasn't just mines, there was also underwater photography. Here's another SMPTE honor roll member, Harold Edgerton, famous for his stroboscopic pictures. And he says, oh, if you want to do an underwater camera, you better get your plugs from Pittsburgh because they have really good sealed equipment. And then there was another paper in the SMPTE Journal about Pittsburgh. This one was, are we really educating by television? And Pittsburgh had the first community television station. And the community started out with Pittsburgh. The mayor said, oh, we ought to have a television station. But he couldn't get much action, and so he went to the executive vice president and general counsel of Pittsburgh Plate Glass and said, can you help me? And the guy said, oh, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And then they were fighting Westinghouse because Westinghouse wanted to have a television station. So the two of them went to the head of Westinghouse and he said, oh, yeah, sure, you should have an educational station. Westinghouse even paid for the tower, and the result was WQED. Quod erat demonstratum. It can be shown. Now, here we have something strange that we don't see very much even today. Scent of Mystery, a movie with smells, and Aroma-Rama behind the Great Wall. And why am I showing those? Well, because the first movie with smell was created by Samuel Rothhapfel, who was a consultant to Pittsburgh Calcium Light. We might know Rothhapfel better by a different name. He was better known as Roxy. And he created the Roxy Movie Palace in New York. He's credited with the dual projector seamless changeover, the Movie Palace, the Rockettes, which were originally called the Roxyettes, and the symbiotic relationship between movies and broadcasting, and also with inspiring sound movies. And how important was he? Well, here's an ad for a movie, and the bulk of the ad is, see what Rothhapfel says. I think this is a good picture. He was also the great-grandfather of Amanda Peet. The first moving images on transport. Ever see a movie on a plane? Well, in Pittsburgh, starting in 1912, you could see a movie on a train. So there at the front of the car, you can see it says Motion Pictures. So back to the Rowland obituary that appeared in the Pittsburgh paper. According to the obituary, he created famous players. I'm not so sure about that, but that became part of Paramount. He definitely created Metro Pictures. That became part of MGM. He made Rudolph Valentino a star. He was first the general manager and then president of First National Pictures, which became part of Warner Brothers. He was general manager of Fox. He was an executive at RKO, MGM, and Republic, and the picture that you see was taken at Culver Studios, and he famously quipped of United Artists, the lunatics have taken over the asylum. But we have a better Pittsburgh connection to United Artists, so here's the United Artists list of stockholders as of 1920. The first stockholder was Charles Chaplin, second Douglas Fairbanks, the third David Wark Griffith, or better known as D.W. Griffith. The fourth one you may not know, Gladys Marie Moore, even though it says Mary there, her name was Marie. She's better known as Mary Pickford. And then there's a person that some of you may have heard of, but not in a Pittsburgh or motion picture context, William G. McAdoo, who was the Democratic candidate for president at one point. Also a famous engineer, did underwater tunnels. But his brother, Malcolm, was the general manager of the Pittsburgh, McKeesport, and Connellsville Railway. And then we have a closer Warner Brothers connection. Across the street from the Nickelodeon, Harry Warner sold men's suits, and he thought this was such a good idea that the brothers created a movie theater in Newcastle, and then they got together and opened up a film exchange to make even more money. And this says it was the Duquesne Film Exchange. It was actually called Duquesne Amusement Supply, but yes, they made a fortune at it, and so that was the origin of Warner Brothers. What about Universal? Well, remember the Polish guy who came and looked at the Nickelodeon? So did Carl Laemmle, and his first theater was a copy of the Nickelodeon, the White Front Theater in Chicago. He created Universal. As for Columbia Pictures, now Sony Pictures, there was a rumor that the guy who founded Columbia Pictures, Harry Cohn, worked at the Nickelodeon. I don't think that was true, but the woman that you're looking at, she was Jane Chester Bartholomew of Pittsburgh. So back to Rowland's SMPTE paper, and he's saying, well, you know, if you're doing a comedy, you might want to have the film projected at 95 feet per minute. And if you're doing something else, something dirge or something, you might want it slower. So he says, unless all directors are, so to speak, standardized, then how can we live with one frame rate? But in fact, we have been living with one frame rate, and I'll explain that in a moment, 24 frames per second for a very long time. But now, directors are becoming unstandardized. So here's a new movie just coming out this month, Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. It's by Ang Lee, who did Life of Pi, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Sense and Sensibility, many other hits. And it's 4K, 3D, 120 frames per second per eye, high dynamic range. An extraordinary amount of data to deal with. But other HFR interested directors include James Cameron and Doug Trumbull, who you just heard of. So this gets to standards principle number 4, times change. So yes, SMPTE first standardized on 16 frames per second, and then the industry went to 24. Vitaphone was the first studio to do 24 frames per second, but it was not for sound quality. Some people think, oh, they had to go 24 frames per second for the sound quality. Well, the Vitaphone system used records, and they were the first records to go at 33 1/3 RPM, but that meant that the sound quality was dependent only on the record and whatever speed the record was going at. It had nothing to do with what the film was going at. The film needed to be at some constant speed, otherwise the sound would go, but it didn't really matter what that rate was. So, a guy named Stanley Watkins, who worked for Western Electric, wanted to figure out the rate. He went to Warner Brothers' chief projectionist, and he said, well, what speed do you project movies at? And he said, well, in the best first run houses, it's anything from 80 to 90 feet a minute, and in the small ones could be more than 100 feet a minute, and so we settled on 90. And that's it. That's where 24 frames per second came from. Sam Warner, by the way, who was working heavily on this sound system, was another Pittsburgh SMPTE Honor Roll member. But the first famous movie that came out from Vitascope was The Jazz Singer. Before that, they had done Don Juan, but only the music for that. And that was in the late 20s. But there had been sound movies in Pittsburgh much earlier. This is in the East Liberty section, the Cameraphone Theater, and it's one of 15 Cameraphone theaters just in the Pittsburgh area starting in 1908. And even before that, you could go to the Grand Opera House and watch movies with sound. They had people standing behind the screen who would talk and sing to match what was being projected. So back to Jenkins, who may have been the first person to project movies for an audience. It was actually his equipment, but it wasn't him. It was his brother Atwood, because it was a long way from Washington, D.C. to Richmond, Indiana. And one time, he made the trip by bicycle. And so I asked Google, well, if I wanted to go by bicycle from Washington, D.C. to Richmond, Indiana, how would I do it? And this was the route, and at the center of the route, you can see what there is. So there was probably a Jenkins-Pittsburgh connection, but I'm not sure of it. So same founder, same Charles Francis Jenkins, same year, 1894, and now he's dabbling already in television. And he says, this is how you can transmit pictures by electricity. But he wasn't the first. This is 3 years earlier now, and Thomas Edison is proposing color television in Chicago in 1891 to be shown at the World's Fair. Now, was he ever going to do it? I'm not sure, but he was sort of making it contingent on his getting the contract to supply the electricity for the fair, which was known as the White City because of all the lighting, but Westinghouse got the contract. And Edison never showed color television. But speaking of color television, here's another standards principle. When black and white television came out, it was very well specified as far as the sync pulses were concerned. When color television came out, there was no standard for the relationship between the color subcarrier and the horizontal sync pulse. So videotape recorders would lock up on the color subcarrier, their plants would lock up on the sync pulse, and the picture shrank every time you did that. But there was nothing that anyone could do about it at the time, so the FCC kind of turned a blind eye to it. And then you may remember Vital came out with Squeeze Zoom, and they could blow up the pictures. And the FCC suddenly said, aha, we are now going to enforce blanking. And so some people blew up the pictures and made them softer, and some people put picture frames around the pictures, blue picture frames or something like that, said, oh yes, that's artistic, that's what we wanted. But people knew that if they would just specify a relationship between the subcarrier and the sync pulse, that would take care of everything. And manufacturers referred to that as standard RS-170A, because 170 was the monochrome standard, 170A had this relationship. But the problem was, if there was a standard, this trigger-happy FCC that was making everyone blow up their pictures and put picture frames around it would say to broadcasters, you must abide by that standard as soon as it came out. So instead of having RS-170A, they had Industrial Electronics Tentative Standard number 1. Gave the industry all the information they needed, but it wasn't a standard the FCC could specify because it was only a tentative standard. SMPTE went on to standardize analog television, and their standard was the first time that the center of the picture was defined. And what's important about that? Well, let's say you have a circle wipe or something like that, and one person does it and has it in one center, and another person does it and has it in another center. Now you have a problem when you want to do editing. So back to Jenkins' video article, there was no scanning in his camera. Each picture element, each pixel, had a wire connecting the camera to the same pixel in the display. The good news about that is no frame rate. Bad news is you need a wire per pixel, so even a resolution of 100 by 100 would be 10,000 wires. But the pixels respond instantly. So here's a German lab that came up with a retinal image sensor. He's got a little spinning top there with a dot on it, and now he's slowing down the playback, but the capture was happening with his sensor at not very high data rate. You'll see that again. But each pixel is responding to change. Now, it's obviously not so good because you're seeing a trail after the black dot, but some improvement on that, and you could have moving pictures where every pixel gets whatever frame rate is appropriate for it. So Jenkins was in 1894 with television. How about earlier? Well, at the right is something that looks very, very similar to Jenkins, a connection from each pixel in the camera to each pixel in the display. This was done by a surveyor in Boston named George R. Carey, and I'm now going to blow up the top of that, January 1877. So here's somebody working on television in January 1877. How could he possibly do that? Well, the electric telegraph had been described in 1753. Photographic cameras, the daguerreotype was around in 1839. The photovoltaic effect was discovered by Antoine Edmond Becquerel in 1839. And image scanning, believe it or not, was discovered was invented in 1842. So here's the Scots magazine in 1753, talking not only about an electric telegraph, but also about how to make insulated wires. And here's another great Scot, Alexander Bain, who came up with scanning. And this is from his US patent in 1848. His UK patent was 1843. He invented pixels. He invented horizontal scanning lines. He invented line sync. He invented frame sync. And perhaps the name frame because his pixels were pieces of metal that were held in a wooden frame. So really, did he do this back then? Yeah, really. For the 25th anniversary of the Institute of Image Electronics Engineers, Masayuki Miyazawa built a fax pair based on the 1843 patent. And as you can see, it's doing a Japanese character and doing a very good job of it. So he won an Emmy in 2016, a technology Emmy for coming up with scanning. And this coming January, there are going to be 3 organizations winning Emmy Awards for opto-electronic transduction. the other key principle of a television camera. And here's the earliest description of a video image by an ophthalmic surgeon in Dublin in 1879, and he says, "I have succeeded in transmitting built-up images of very simple luminous objects." And that was doing that same one wire connecting each pixel. But he knew about scanning, so he said, "I attempted to do this with a single circuit, but the selenium had too much lag." As you can see on the right, the horizontal scale is minutes. That's how long it takes the selenium to recover. So he's hoping to find some better substance so that everything should act on the circuit 10 times in a second. There you see the first video frame rate, 10 frames per second. And that's 7 years before the first movies that were shot on a band. These were done by another SMPTE Honor Roll member, Louis Le Prince, in Leeds, England in 1886. Now in 1880, here was another television system. Remember that scanning is critical in doing it fast enough. Well, if you have those pendulums, that takes a long time. How about if we have just vibrating mirrors? That would be cool. So here's a guy, Maurice Leblanc, and he says, let's do television with vibrating mirrors. And in fact, we can do color television with 7 primaries. So that's vibrating mirror image scanning in 1880. Here's vibrating mirror image scanning in 2015 at Carnegie Mellon. And they're using digital micromirror devices for the scanning. Now, Carnegie Mellon earlier had done digital television research. So here's a paper that appeared in the SMPTE Journal about how to recover digital signals properly. But that wasn't the first DTV in Pittsburgh. This might have been the first DTV in Pittsburgh, WDTV, which was Pittsburgh's first television station. Maybe, I'll get to that in a moment. And Pittsburgh became the golden spike that connected the East Coast networks to the Midwest networks. And so when WDTV did their first television show out of the Syria Mosque, all networks in the United States carried the show from Pittsburgh. So whatever you were watching, if you were watching television in the United States, you were watching a show coming out of Pittsburgh. But that was actually not Pittsburgh's first television station, or at least not the first to transmit moving pictures. This was 8XAV at Westinghouse, and that's Frank Conrad, and he was transmitting radio movies. But there's a more interesting thing, I think, that that Westinghouse did with regard to television. So here are 2 B-29s, and the significant date here is August 9th, 1945. Some of you may be familiar with that date. That's the date that the second atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, the one over Nagasaki. And the B-29 that dropped that was Boxcar, that's on the left, shown with its crew. But on the exact same date, here in Pittsburgh, Westinghouse announced a plan. Now, WDTV went on the air in 1949. This is 1945, so it's 4 years earlier. AT&T hasn't put in network facilities yet. There's no coaxial cable or microwave facilities. There are very, very few television stations, so the U.S. is basically televisionless. So Westinghouse says, well, you know, if we take one of those B-29s, which is pressurized, we could fly it at 30,000 feet, and then we could transmit from that over a range of a 211-mile radius. So this was their plan. This appeared in Radiocraft. Just 8 of the B-29s could transmit to each other and network from coast to coast, and 14 of them could cover 78% of the U.S. population with television at a lower cost than having television transmitters and towers. And so on June 23rd, 1948, again, this is the year before WDTV, this B-29, a Stratovision B-29, is flying overhead Pittsburgh, 25,000 feet, and it's relaying the Republican National Convention, which was taking place in Philadelphia, via WMAR-TV in Baltimore to Zanesville, Ohio. It could actually be seen farther west than Zanesville, but they couldn't find some place for doing appropriate stuff. But the next year, the networks get connected, WDTV goes on the air, so we're back to conventional television. But the idea doesn't quite die. So in 1971, Westinghouse changes it a little bit into a blimp. And they say, we could carry television transmitting equipment in a balloon. And in Korea, they say, oh, that's a great idea. And in the Bahamas, they say, oh, that's a great idea, because we can pick up television from Florida and cover the Bahamas. So here is Westinghouse's TCOM, which was then spun off into its own company. So I was talking a little bit about Carnegie Mellon. That was Carnegie Mellon then. Here's Carnegie Mellon now. They have an entertainment technology center doing a lot of work on video games, but I don't want to restrict things to just Carnegie Mellon. University of Pittsburgh was significant too. Here's the Pitt grad who pioneered TV. And there's Vladimir Kozmazorkin. And he was certainly one of the people to come up with the idea of a camera tube and to make one work. The dates are a little bit iffy. Here's his obituary in the New York Times, which says that he demonstrated it in Pittsburgh in 1924. Maybe, maybe not. But anyway, it's another SMPTE honor roll member, just 88 and 100 years, and you've got 3 of them in Pittsburgh. And when the book was written about it, of course, it was published in Pittsburgh. So here's another paper that appeared in SMPTE Journal, and this one is about an analysis of the application of fluorescent lamps to motion picture photography. Same issue we're having today, or some of the same issues with LED lighting. You don't have a continuous spectrum, you don't have continuous light, but where did this come from? It came from University of Pittsburgh, but not the engineering school. It's from the Department of Anatomy at the School of Medicine. And they figured out about fluorescent lights and video. And I don't want to restrict things to just Carnegie Mellon or Pitt. Here's another school in the Monongahela Valley, Tom Savini's Special Makeup Effects Program. So here we have someone who's one of the top special effects makeup people in the world, and he's teaching it here in the Pittsburgh area. And here is a French guy, Léon Lepontois, and he's talking about something he calls the telectroscope, and this appeared in Scientific American Supplement on June 10th of 1893. And you can see that his TV set has a nice chimney on the left, and on the right, that is probably the first depiction of a camera-mounted light ever in history, 1893. And down at the bottom, you can see that he's reading this paper at the Pittsburgh Electric Club. Wow, you know, this guy from France, and he's reading the paper at the Pittsburgh Electric Club. Well, he worked at Westinghouse. So Westinghouse had actually been involved in transmitting live moving images no later than 1893. So which gets the big screen? Are television and motion pictures really different, or are they the same thing? Well, as you saw from the trailer, early on, motion pictures were viewed one person at a time, and there's a television system from 1898 with projection. And in fact, at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, they had public television offices, which were theaters for watching live large screen TV, which they used both video projectors and even flat screen displays. That's an actual image from a flat screen display. But this is perhaps the most amazing thing that happened in Pittsburgh with relation to motion pictures. This is from a book that was published by a local patent firm, Connolly Brothers and McTeague. It's a legitimate book about patents, and they also sometimes took out patents themselves. And so here's a patent that they got in 1879 for an automatic telephone exchange, dialing. Dialing was possibly invented here in Pittsburgh. And here's a publication that was available in Pittsburgh, American Manufacturer and Iron World, actual 1880 publication. And in the February 20th, 1880 issue, it talks about that patent firm, Connolly Brothers and McTeague. It spells Connolly wrong, but so did 5 Pittsburgh business directories that I checked. And it says that they've come up with an idea for the automatic telephone exchange, and we know that they got a patent for that. But it says they've applied for another patent, and it's to transmit images of who you're talking to on the phone. And they say that Mr. McTeague has been able to reproduce clearly and faithfully in a dark room at his residence the images of persons at the other end of the line. Now, could he possibly have done that? Some really great historians that I respect call this a hoax. And there are some other hoaxes associated with moving images, so it could be a hoax, except they are a real Pittsburgh patent firm. That was a real Pittsburgh publication. You would think that if it was totally wrong, they wouldn't want their clients reading something that's totally wrong, and they would have sent a letter to the editor or something like that. There is no such letter to the editor. So was television invented in Pittsburgh in 1880? A puzzlement. I don't know, but I do know that Yul Brynner performed The King and I at the Syria Mosque in Pittsburgh, where the first Pittsburgh television show on WDTV, which was broadcast on all networks, happened.